The division on the deployment, I was G3 during the training, and so I will have a particular focus on this thing. And there will be other focuses that are present in the room, and I certainly encourage them to pipe up if they have something they feel is very significant to talk about. But I am going to move, and I have a number of slides. What I did basically to prepare for this, I went back and reviewed a number of documents that I still had in my possession from this era, and my focus is trying to give you a contextual description of what the SFOR 14 mobilization, deployment, mission execution looked like. Because it's really kind of different from many of the mobilizations that we did. So this is the agenda. So I was first start by talking about how the stage was set for us in a very interesting way, something that other divisions that executed this mission did not have. And the first being our state partnership program relationship that was established with Croatia gave us about a 10-year experience of working with individuals from the Balkans. And so I would argue that we had a better understanding of the cultural differences and the conflict that took place that led to the war than other units did. And that gave us a little bit of a leg up, at least at the senior leadership levels, because we had been forced to deal with the situation in the former Yugoslavia and at least have some basic understanding of it. In addition to that existing relationship, Bravo and Charlie companies of the 2nd Battalion, 136th Infantry were originally sourced for deployment on SFOR 11 in 2000. Now those two companies never actually deployed on SFOR 11, but going through the preparatory work to plan their training and to interface with, at that time, the 18th Airborne Corps and the 25th Infantry Division, who would have been their higher headquarters had they executed that mission, gave us senior leadership in the state a significant advantage when the mission for SFOR 14 did drop to us, because we had already been familiarized with the things that we were going to have to do, which were much more onerous than the actual execution of the mission, as has been mirrored in most of the mobilizations. But it really gave us a leg up. So we were notified for SFOR 14 after Bravo and Charlie, the 136, had been dropped from the SFOR 11 deployment. And that also was a little bit of a different situation because of the way that we were mobilized. So those of you who have been to CGSC or will go to CGSC, there are 3 times that the National Guard, 3 circumstances under which the National Guard can be called into federal service. The first is called Presidential Selected Reserve Call-Up. That's an extreme limitation on the President by the Congress. The number of soldiers that may be mobilized at any given time is limited, and the duration for which they may be mobilized is very limited. This number has changed, though, both in the number and the duration, since Operation Desert Storm. Originally, this was supposed to be limited to a 90-day call-up. Over time, that 90-day authority was extended out to 270 days, and 270-day PSRC was in effect at the time that the SFOR 14 mission came out. However, that 270-day limitation with a 180-day boots on the ground requirement was somewhat limiting in how much time we could do training after mobilization. So the solution that was applied for the SFOR 14 deployment under PSRC was to do a lot of training in IDT and AT over the 2 years before we deployed. The next slides are extracted from the training briefing that we actually did to our senior mentor. Actually, this one is a training brief that went to then Lieutenant General B.B. Bell, who was the commanding general of the 3rd Corps, and 3rd Corps had the task of overseeing the train-up for SFOR 14. Incidentally, and to our advantage, after General Bell approved our training plan, he was then promoted to a 4th star and assigned as the commanding general of U.S. Army Europe. That was actually quite useful for us because as we made the transition from FORSCOM oversight to USERA's oversight, the USERA goons all thought that they should apply some additional training requirements on us because, you know, we were going to be in their theater, and who did 3rd Corps think they were? And we were able to say, no problem, just go get the guy who approved our training plan to approve the changes. Oh, he's your boss, by the way. And we had no modifications made by the USERA staff as we went through our training because we were able to use that leverage. So that was kind of interesting. This is an actual slide from the briefing that we provided to 3rd Corps. This briefing was provided on 10 April 2002. So this was would that be? 18 months before the mission execution date. And these were the assumptions that we were dealing with, that we were pretty sure our dates were going to be solid. We figured there would be changes to the task force. We assumed that the 3rd Corps Force Com would approve our unit nominations. And as is evidenced here, we did not know when or where our MRE, or mission rehearsal exercise, now called an MRX, was going to be conducted. And those are kind of significant things when you're trying to plan the movement of the task force, et cetera. This is the actual sourcing slide that we had on 2 May of 2002. You'll notice that there had already been changes. All the things that are in red are things that had changed from previous briefing that had occurred. The task forces were being downsized, other elements were being increased in size. We still did not have a sourcing nomination for our aviation task force. So though we were about to go into some fairly significant staff training, we still didn't know who all the players were going to be. That's fairly typical, and all of us that have been through deployment experience know that this is kind of how things shake out, but it is interesting to remember how little we actually knew about the mission we were going to conduct 18 months before we had to conduct it. These are actually, this is the division total slide of what we were going to take from the 34th Division, from the Minnesota National Guard for the most part. Although we did have some Iowa folks and non-divisional Florida, is that right? Who was here from Florida? I don't remember that. Well, we'll have to figure that one out.
Oh, that was that terrain team, wasn't it?
They were Alabama.
Yeah, Alabama. They were Alabama. They didn't have electricity in their armory. So
well, it was right at that same point, right on the border there.
Yeah.
Close.
Yeah.
We're using it to do deer hunting maps for training.
All right, there we go. So, fairly significant deployment at the time. This was the mission statement that we had going in. This is actually the mission statement that was in effect as we were going through our train-up. It did morph once we got into theater. Actually morphed between the time we read this and we were in the theater. Moving forward. I thought this was actually more illustrative than the mission statement, because this is really kind of what we thought we were going to be doing. These are the things that we saw important, and it should be noted that the war ended in 1996. We were going in 2003, 7 years later. And the Dayton Peace Accords had laid out some pretty specific things that were supposed to happen. And there was a civil component, and a judicial component, and a police component, and a military component. And the only objectives that had been met on the timelines that were established when the Dayton Peace Accords were signed were the military objectives. And all other aspects of society had failed to complete the tasks that they were responsible for. And so we saw our mission start morphing into, can we help those civil authorities make the progress necessary to get the hell out of the Balkans? Because clearly the civilians are not getting it done. And there were a number of non-military organizations that seemed to be coming from the same places, but worked for different people, like the European Union Police Mission, and some other European Union activities that were separate from the NATO activities, even though they worked for the same people, which was very interesting and very confusing. The commander's intent, you'll notice the International Police Task Force was being withdrawn. There were a lot of changes that went on all the way through this thing, to include, during our train-up, we anticipated having a Russian contingent in the task force and actually met them on our recons, but the Russians had redeployed prior to our arrival in theater, and so that changed the shape on the ground and took away one of the potentially most interesting aspects of what this deployment might have meant for us. This was our training mission statement. That's what we were going to do. Not rocket science here. But there was a multi-echelon aspect to this, as there has been in all of the major deployments that we've done, because we weren't just taking the division headquarters, we also were taking subordinate units, just as the brigade went with its subordinate units, and so you had to worry about staff training and individual training and platoon training and squad training. All those things had to happen simultaneously, and this was really the first time that we had to go through that sort of thing. So I threw this slide in here. I'm not going to go through it, but just to kind of overlay some of that complexity and the layering that we had to do. You'll notice that we did individual and section proficiency, horizontal integration, and vertical integration. Anybody want me to talk about that? Good. as we briefed this thing, and these were all builds in the original slide, it was a fairly complex briefing and a fairly complex training plan, not unlike the horse blankets that were laid down for future training. That's what our road to war looked like. You notice we identified a 12-month window and a 6-month window because many of our training requirements had expiration dates. You had to have qualified on your individual weapon within 6 months of going into theater. There are other tasks you had to complete within 12 months. So if you did everything too early, you wouldn't be validated when you went. So that complicated things a little bit, and then we had a lot of complex things that we had to do in the last 6 months prior to deployment, while we were still trying to keep employers happy. That's just more stuff. So at the end of this slide, again, these were the issues that we had. We didn't know the dates or location of our MRX. We didn't know where we were going to mob out of. That was kind of important to us as well. In the end, it turned into Fort Deploy, but we did not know that until fairly late in the game. Didn't know where our aviation task force was going to come from. In the end, it came from Texas, and actually some from Kansas as well. And then some decisions about the structure, which continued to evolve. And at the same time, as we were preparing for SFOR 14, the division was also a mission to support the K-45 Bravo mission. And although in the end the SFOR 14 mission was executed as a brigade task force, the structure of the headquarters was mirroring a division headquarters, as was the K-4. And so Minnesota was given the task to basically create 2 division headquarters from 1, deploy them nearly simultaneously in the same theater for similar but not identical missions. The difference was the K-4 mobilization, because the president had declared a different kind of emergency, he was able to use partial mobilization authority, which at that time allowed up to 2 years mobilization. Therefore, they were able to mobilize, train, and deploy, as opposed to train, mobilize, deploy. It did task Minnesota pretty heavily, though, for the types of staff officers and NCOs and units that were necessary to perform missions. So once we got into the theater, we established a campaign plan. We looked at what had to be done, and we named our campaign the Winter Line. That's kind of a common thing in the division for obvious reasons. This is now switching to extracts from a slide that we actually used in the theater. You will note that I have removed any of the FOUO slides from the briefing, so everything here is unclassified. But these are the 3 pillars of our campaign plan: military reform, sustained peace, and force protection. Force protection being inwardly focused, sustained peace being outwardly focused, and military reform being focused against the armed forces in BIH and the primary responsibility of the Joint Military Authority, the commander of which is with us tonight, General Al-Saria. Within Operation Winter Line, we identified those 3 key areas. There were 3 then lines of action within those lines of lines of operation within the lines of action. This did morph over time, but you will see that our intended outcome from our decisive point in line of action 1 was partnership for peace membership. In 2, it was regional stability, and safe and secure operations really went back to our own force protection issues. We looked at our own safety, base protection, but also our relationships with others in the theater. Sept. The task force was actually comprised of individuals from 27 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico in the end. It was 93% Army National Guard, 7% from the USAR, and we're showing 0% from the active component. It was actually 6 dudes or dudettes, I don't remember if they were male or female. But one thing that we did not do was directed everyone wear our patch, and so the patch they wore is the one they wore when they came to us, and so there were 35 different unit patches worn in Task Force Eagle during the SFOR 14 deployment. That was not universal among all the SFOR rotations. Some CGs were awfully particular about wearing their own patch. We didn't do that. We also had 12 countries represented inside the task force, because we did have a multinational brigade comprised of Polish and Spanish soldiers, a Turkish battalion task force, a Slovakian company, a staff guy from Moldova who was the hardest working dude in the 3 shop and the hardest to understand. And a number of other folks. The area of responsibility, this means not much to anybody unless you were there, but we basically had responsibility for about 1/3 of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this is late when we had Fort Clark opened up. We conducted a number of things, including harvest operations, which were basically to remove military arms and ordnance from the hands of the general population. I would argue that our maneuver units, that's the thing they were focused on the most. But we also had some other operations that we had to conduct that were related to the capture of persons who were indicted for war crimes, and also operations that were directed toward persons of interest in the global war on terrorism. And without going into any of the classified stuff, that kind of is the scope of what we did. But when we get to, and this has to do with weapons storage sites, the bane of General Alcerio's existence over there. Reduction in the number of weapons storage sites. It was common practice in Yugoslavia because Tito didn't know who was going to attack, but he was convinced somebody was. It was either going to be the West or the Russians. And consequently, he distributed ammunition in caches all over the country. However, they were not properly stored, and so the weather would get to the artillery shells and they would rust, become unsafe, and eventually detonate. And so you had these little explosions all over the country. We finally convinced them that it would be in their best interest to consolidate those weapons storage sites into things that would be amenable to the West. Unfortunately, no one had the money to build the kind of controlled climate facilities that we insist on storing our munitions in, so we never really got to the end of that, but we made significant progress. Over the time that SFOR was conducted from 1995, you will see a tremendous downslope, a big one from 95 to 96, and then fairly stable for a few years. But the thing eventually dwindled down to where the slide ends with us. It did continue for one rotation after us, and then they turned it off and switched it into something else. But the numbers of soldiers that were dedicated to the mission continued to decline. In fact, did decline during our deployment. We were tasked with downsizing the mission while we were there. And so now I'm shifting into the accomplishment. This is the briefing that we did at the end of the thing and talked about, here's what we did while we were here. Within the three areas, we had some significant successes. Our top achievement was Operation Armadillo. General Elisario and his team established a process by which they used an assembly line to destroy unsafe, unused, unwanted munitions in a very industrial process, where they moved connexes full of explosives to the range, blew them up, created seismic activity that was readable all over the world because these things were really, really big. In fact, we got quite a kick out of it because we were in country at the same time that the occupation of Iraq was occurring, and they were blowing up. They were having these big deals on Facebook, and well, it wasn't Facebook, but it was on the internet about, oh, they blew up some weapons in Iraq. And it was like, and meanwhile, Elisario was rocking the house from 100 miles away at the DR range. It blew up a lot of stuff.
The deputy commander.
Joint military affairs.
Yeah, different authorities.
So maybe in there somewhere, but not in that direct chain.
Harvest was a big deal, not so much in what we were able to collect, but that we got the Bosnians actually doing the collection. So we were able to get out of the business. That was a big deal for us. We drove 1 million miles, 4,400 flight hours, only 4 recordable accidents over a winter rotation. And of some significance, 800 U.S. soldiers who graduated from professional development or other qualifying schools. We estimated that at $1.3 million worth of Army training that got done during the deployment. That's important because once we got back from Bosnia, what happened next? Well, Colonel Elisario turned around and took the 1st Brigade off to Iraq. And some of the qualification of those soldiers was completed while they were in the Balkans, so that it did not diminish his ability to train when we go to Iraq. We also did something that had never been done before. There was, during the end of our rotation, a little bit of excitement in the KFOR area of operation, and with less than 10 hours notice, we were able to deploy Bravo Company 2 of the 136 from Eagle Base to Camp Bonsfield. Thank you. And I'm going to get a little bit. This is an interesting mission because it was not requested by the K4 team. In fact, I called John Cry, who was the chief of staff of the K45 Bravo rotation, and said, John, we're sending a rifle company to you. And he said, well, why are you doing that? Because they told us to. I don't know. I guess you guys got some stuff going on over there. Well, how have we got it under control? We don't need to send a company over. I said, John, look, man, this is way beyond you and me. this is NATO getting involved in this thing, and we're shipping you a company at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we're gonna have another company on the queue to go 6 hours after that if they want them. What the hell are we gonna do with them? Well, I don't know, you have to figure that out. So, behind the scenes stuff.
Not my problem.
Some of the other weird things, that there were really 3 chiefs of staff of the 34th Division during this period, because John Cry commanded, or was the chief of staff of the Task Force Falcon contingent. I was the chief of staff of the Task Force Eagle contingent. And back here in Minnesota, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Brusegard was the acting chief of the division remnants that were here. So it was an interesting time and difficult. It will be difficult for the historians to figure it all out in the end. But we did, we consolidated. Charlie 2, the 136, got them rolled back in. We notified a Polish company from the Multinational Battle Group, and it was the first time that intra-Balkan reserves were used as part of in the joint operational area. So that was kind of a big deal. A lot of military reform in Bosnia-Herzegovina, closed 10 weapon storage site, stopped shifting munitions back and forth, got 18 minefields cleared, did a lot of work with the soldiers of the former warring factions to begin to work together. And again, this is a place that General Elisario was kind of instrumental in, that we had to fight it through our lawyers, but we needed labor to move heavy junk from one weapon storage site into the connexes so it could be shipped. The Republic of Srpska and the Federation soldiers were there, and they weren't really doing anything else because they didn't have any money to train or barely feed themselves. Basically, they were willing to do the work if we'd feed them lunch. And so we made the request to USERA, and the staff judge advocate, of course, said, absolutely not. We don't have a cross-service agreement with the Republic of Srpska or the Federation, so we can't do that. So, come on. This is not, we're not helping them out. We're actually getting in-kind assistance for them. And in the end, we got to grease the water. So for the meager price of lunch, we actually got, not only did we originally we did it independently, where only the RS soldiers or only the Federation soldiers would be there. But eventually we got to the point where both Federation and RS soldiers were on site at the same locations, working together to load stuff into connexes so it could go be destroyed. We donated a lot of excess equipment through a humanitarian assistance program. We did a number of de minimis engineering programs, including water wells, roads, and bridges. Project management. There was an American library at Tuzla University that was completed with troop labor. We made some significant changes in crime and corruption. We held chiefs of police and state border service officials accountable. We blew up a bunch of junk, 120 connexes full of munitions. 60-car train load of munitions is the equivalent. 3 scheduled explosions 3 times each week, 5,000 pounds at a shot, 54 tons of C4. We actually ran the Army out of C4. They had to let out a bid for C4, and in the interim had provided this funky flake C4, looked like frosted flakes, and they would actually pour it out and use that, mostly because they needed to get rid of it. Also destroyed 4,700 man pads that didn't actually come from Bosnia. That's a different story. Collected a lot of stuff in the hinterland. Big one here is change the emphasis to the local lead. Conducted 10,927 presence patrols, a lot of tactical vehicle miles, cost savings to the post-mill budget, 488 distinguished visitors. Our G4 for the deployment, John Dewey, started weighing distinguished visitors in tons, not in numbers. That was kind of interesting. We enjoyed that. The Brigade TV show became very popular, and we had a lot of stuff, a lot of interesting things that happened. Force protection, we completed our vulnerability assessments and really changed. We took very seriously our force protection responsibilities, perhaps more so than previous deployments had done. We were very successful from a safety perspective, did some work on some roads there. Let me see if I can get, this one's kind of fun for me to look at. We called it conservation of logistic assets. When we rolled in there in S4 14, S4 11 and 12 still had 327 items of excess rolling stock. Got any logisticians in the room? Excess rollings, 327 prime movers from two rotations ago. So we moved a bunch of stuff out of the theater, got rid of a bunch of our own excess, and that was good. We added some infrastructure there. We got all of our flu shots taken, okay, so some things never change. That was important enough for us to mention that. And then we also tried to help SFOR 15 conduct their transition of authority, protect them successfully. There's our conclusion slide from that, and then I threw this slide in there. 811 soldiers went out to school while we were in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And that's probably the really important thing about the deployment in the big scheme of things, is that it gave staff officers, staff NCOs, our soldiers and leaders, an understanding of what a mobilization deployment would be like, and it postured them to more smoothly execute the future mobilizations of the brigade, the division, and other units.
The one thing I didn't see in there, sir, was the
Yeah,
wagon. You didn't mention the wagon for the 35th.
I didn't mention the wagon from the 35th because I didn't see that as a huge accomplishment. So the 35th Infantry Division, they have a wagon wheel as their patch. They actually have a Conestoga wagon that they felt was very important to have around, so they shipped it over from Kansas. And then they went to ship it back, and Customs says, "You can't ship that back, are you out of your mind? That thing's gotta be fumigated in a hermetically sealed container for 45 days to kill all the bugs. Ain't no way that thing's getting back," but I think we got it out of there.
We did get it out of there.
Yeah, okay. The other thing we got out of there were those weapons in the rack back there.
Oh, yeah.
That was stuff that no previous rotation had been able to do, and we barely got that done as well. But CG USER insisted that they had to be demilitarized before they'd let them back, and when they came back here, the Army said, "Well, they're not weapons anymore, all they are is junk, you just need to melt them down." No, you need to continue. You need to get through custom.
It's interesting that when you look back at some of the things that went on in these early deployments were reiterated again in Iraq. That the Army was still facing those same problems, new theater, new groups, we did the same thing with weapons reductions, we did the same thing with container reductions, we did the same things with force reductions. So this was it was a great primary and a great learning environment to see how all those things work. And so it was not the first time Nash and much of the staff had seen some of these same challenges, which was, I think, really to our advantage. Thank you. When we got back, it was.
Sir, do you know what percentage of us that participated in 14 or 5 Bravo went to the division rotation or in the 1st Brigade?
I've seen that number, Travis, and I don't remember where I saw it, but it's out there somewhere. There's some briefing somewhere, an annual report perhaps. I don't know. It was a bunch.
Yeah. Because we didn't have a big turnover of membership in the Guard during that time.
Ladies and gentlemen, any other questions? I have 17:01 according to computer time. I thank you for your attention, and hope you'll join some of us at the Rosemount VFW in just a few minutes.